Okay. You can hear me, right?
Yep. Yeah.
All right. I think you'll have to forgive me tonight because my talk is a little bit academic and compared to what has come previously, I don't have any expectations. But I remember that I'm going to be speaking to people who are in school, so I'll be forgiven. So I drive technology in Lagos State, in innovation, in digital IT. And for me, it's my passion. And today I thought I would talk about that passion a little bit, but what really drives it. And I thought to myself, you know, technology signals development, right? And wherever you go in the world, when you experience or encounter technology, you know you are in a somewhat developed place. And it was very important that I use that example to talk about the undercurrents of development. And any day these slides want to answer me, I will be happy. All right. So technology is an indicator of development. The most developed countries in the world develop, drive, use technology to drive the economy, to drive socio-economic development, and all of the very nice things we know about technology. I want to give a few examples. So the slide there shows some of the most technologically advanced countries. We know them quite well, right? And when you look at them and their GDPs per capita, there's a thread, a common thread that shows us that these countries are technologically advanced. Another common thread I found is the dedication and the prioritization to research and development in these countries. There are some figures on the board, right, that indicates R&D spend from all of these different countries. And between them, you would count between 2.3 and 3.49% of the GDP is spent on R&D, right? And so because of that prioritization, there is a lot of technology output from these countries. And so I think it was important to highlight that and say that, look, technology is indeed an indicator of development. So why am I focusing on this? Because, as I mentioned, R&D spend equals, or the likelihood that there's a greater amount of R&D spend, it means that there's a greater likelihood of technology advancement. So, that is all well and good. In Nigeria, over the past 5 years, there has been some progress in driving technology development, especially in the area of innovation startups. Between 2019 and 2022, about a 210% increase on inward venture capital investment has come into the country. Many companies, as was mentioned earlier, Flutterwave, Andela, Paystack, a lot of them have shown the nascent potential that is available in Nigeria. But there are still some issues right? Yes, there has been progress, but one of the things that we've noted is that while technology is an indicator of development, it's not the cause, right? So what causes technology development? What causes the developed countries to have such outputs? Rule of law. I know it sounds like the most obvious thing, right? But please permit me to give you some examples. In 1978, a new Chinese leader came to power called Deng Xiaoping. This was after Chairman Mao had died. Chairman Mao, I'm sure some people have heard about him. He had a project in China called the Cultural Revolution, right? Where the entire state of China was reorganized based on certain principles. And it was a complete disaster. Almost 20 million people lost their lives. And so in 78, that man, Deng Xiaoping, came, saw how Western countries were doing well. I mean, China at that point had actually invested in technology. They had nuclear weapons. They had invested heavily in military technology as well. They had invested in trying to build cars, and all of that. But they were still lacking behind in the indices of development and even just sheer technology output. And so what Deng Xiaoping decided to do was to start to enact certain rules. In a communist society, right, all property is shared, right? It sounds good, doesn't it? All property is shared. Let's share everything. Let's have everything in common. But the problem is that that kind of system never leads to productivity. Why? Because one Deng Xiaoping decided to start enacting property rights, which means that a person can actually own property. Productivity started to go up. And so all of the businesses started getting liberalized. People could actually start companies, and the value or the effort that you put into something will be the direct result of what you get out of it. And so it exploded. So between 1978 and the 1990s, there's a massive explosion in productivity and in technology output. Same thing in the United States. As we all know, there is a strong intellectual property regime, which means that a man can invest there, your ideas are protected, and so you can put all your effort into going all the way to solve a problem. Because you know that whatever effort you put in, the system will help you to protect it. And so I can invest away. I can put all my effort. As opposed to you try to build something in a place where they can expropriate your property at any time. And then so you are not incentivized to build anything. And so rule of law, as mundane as it all seems, provides a certain bedrock for development. Now, I think, so sorry. I think I'll get used to this thing one day.
The undercurrent of technology.
Oh yes. Okay. Oh Lord. We are having Houston. We have a problem. All right. So I was going to go to the next page. That was going to talk about. There we are. We talked about rule of law, but here is where we are going to focus most of our talk on. a cultural shift is needed. And if you look closely at the slides, there are some words that are highlighted there. Now, these words were basically coined by a professor named Gerd Hofstede. They are the 5 or 6, if you would, cultural dimensions, right? And what do these cultural dimensions, what do they mean? If you look at the first one, to my right, that says power distance index, it is the level to which a society can tolerate inequality, right? And so it means that if a society is okay or relatively okay with huge gaps in power dynamics, that will determine their power distance index. So if your power distance index is very high, you can tolerate inequality. But if it's low, then your society values equality. And I'll give an example. How many of us have read a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell? Yes. Now, Malcolm Gladwell used an example of South Korean Airlines. South Korean Airlines had one of the worst safety records on the planet at a point in time. Planes, I don't know the frequency at the time, but they had very poor safety record. There were crashes, there were incidents. And so it was a huge problem for the country. And so what did they try to do? They brought in consultants and said, look, we've got to get to the bottom of why we are always having safety issues. So of course they brought in American consultants, Western consultants. They came into the company, did a lot of surveys, did a lot of tests, went in and studied the culture of the company. And they came to a conclusion. They said, the culture of the society is actually what South Korean Airlines was exhibiting, which stated that South Korea was a highly deferential society, sort of like Nigeria, which means that there is an insanely high respect for your elders. In fact, in South Korea, you couldn't really address elders while looking at them in the face. And so the issue was that co-pilots, you know, in a plane, there's a pilot and a co-pilot. When the head pilot is making a mistake, the co-pilot cannot correct him. And so there were issues. So even if he was making a mistake, you know, you don't really talk to them directly, as opposed to the American way. Americans can talk to you, you know, no matter who you are. And so they found that co-pilots weren't addressing the issues. And so they brought in trainers, they brought in so many people to try to change the culture of the company, right? And gave co-pilots sort of like mechanisms to address pilots, to also show them while they were making mistakes and things like that. Of course, not to do it rudely, but to, you know, proactively engage head pilots. And from the research, crashes went down by 80%. And why did I use that example? Because it points to a cultural context that ultimately decides the fate of that organization. That's just one example of the power distance index. Now, if you look at individualism versus collectivism, that was the story of capitalism, democracy versus communism, right? Are individual talents, right, and differences respected? Or do we have mob mentality? Or do we have, you know, all kinds of revisionist or groupthink? Because let me tell you something. I did a course in Harvard called Organizational Choice Architecture, right? And they said one of the most dangerous things is groupthink. right? Because if you notice, even say in where people are gathered together, one single idea can actually take over a whole crowd, even if the whole crowd doesn't agree with it, right? And so the benefit of individualism, right, brings together different ideas to merge them into one and to have the best outcome, right? And so individualism versus collectivism is also a cultural context that can spell the fate of an organization or a country, right? Are different ideas respected, or are we just revisionist group thinkers, right, that just pander to maybe the most easiest route? And in organizational choice architecture, there is a book called The Wisdom of Crowds that takes into consideration not just groupthink, but the individual decisions of people, the diversity in the decisions and the thinking of people, taking them all into account to come up with the best solution. That is a cultural context. The next one, masculinity versus femininity. The traits of masculinity: ambition, resilience, going all the way to achieve something, versus femininity, empathy, right? And making sure that we agree, we are all on the same level, equality. Now, where your culture falls to within that spectrum will also determine how far you go as an organization or as a company, right? We've seen that Scandinavian countries, right, from Hofstede's research has shown that some of the Scandinavian countries are high on more feminine values than some of the more developing countries, right? And that's why they have high welfare societies, they have more equal societies, because they believe that people shouldn't be too far apart on the spectrum of development. And so the collective ideology of your society will determine the policies that you implement. Uncertainty avoidance index. This is very important, right? I did tell you that this was a little bit academic, so forgive me. Uncertainty avoidance. The rate at which you try to avoid uncertainty in your life also determines how your country will be or your organization, right? It means that you don't want to live a life of unpredictability, right? And that's why in countries where the uncertainty avoidance index is low, there are a lot of rules for how you will behave. And for others where the uncertainty avoidance, right? Sorry, it's the other way around. Uncertainty avoidance, where it's high, right? There are a lot of rules. But where it's low, there's a little bit more unpredictability. And that is how, if you fall somewhere there, it also determines your society and your organization. Long-term versus short-term orientation. That is very important. Are you going to think of just today or the future? Right? Very, very important. Cultural context. And of course, indulgence versus restraint. Right? Are you going to eat the little you have now, or you are going to invest it? These are all ways of thinking. These are all ways that whatever part of the spectrum you fall on will determine how your company, your future company, survives, operates, or how your country also moves ahead with some of the things it wants to do. Right? Let us forget racism. Let us forget some of the headliners, right, that talk about how countries invest in technology or how they invest in this or in that. The collective consciousness of that country is ultimately what will determine the policies and the kinds of companies that come out of that country. And I'll give one final story. You know, there was an example we always used when we went on certain lectures. Imagine you were going to a store, right? And you wanted to pick, say, sticks of plantain from a box of plantains. You took one, you took it home, you cut it open, and inside of it, it was rotten, right? And you go back the next day, you said, this plantain is rotten, I'm going to look for one, right, that is not rotten. You search the box, you pick out another one. You said, this one will not surely be good. You go home, you cut it up, and it's rotten. You go a third time. You say, this time I'm really going to look hard. You go in there, you search completely. You think, this surely must be good. You take it home, you cut it open, and it's rotten again. Then you go to the store manager or the person selling the plantain, and you said, look, 3 times I've come here, I've picked plantain, it's all rotten. The probability that this entire batch of plantain is rotten is very high, right? Mathematics. So think of your country or maybe an organization. Let's use the country for an example, right? Since 1960, we've had 16 leadership changes, right? From military to civilian, right? And we are still, still clamoring for a lot of, or still clamoring on a lot of issues, right? And in fact, if you look at Cameroon, that is next to us, the president of Cameroon has been there as long as I've been alive. In fact, our country has experienced, in relative terms to other African countries, the most leadership changes. We've gone from coup, we've done, 4th successive election now, and all of that. The question we need to ask ourselves is that, as we are picking plantains, that's how leaders are coming out. The question is the batch that they are coming from.
Now you're talking.
So, and that's why we are talking about cultural context. A good apple cannot come from a bad tree. Right? If you want a good plantain, it means that at least the batch you are picking from must be good. If most of the batches there are bad, the probability that you will pick a bad singular one is very high. But if most of them are good, the probability that you will pick a good one is also very high. Correct? So, let us deal with the collective cultural context of our country. And then when we go and pick from that batch, we will be picking something that is that the probability is very high that it will be good. I think I rest my case. Thank you very much.